we're going to take a look at finding the square root of a negative number. These numbers are considered to be complex numbers, imaginary numbers, or non-real numbers. I'm just going to do off to the side here, looking at square root of 4. The square root of 4 equals the number 2. 4 is a perfect square. The reason it equals 2 is because if I multiply that number to itself, or if I square it, I get the value of 4. If I take a look at my first example, the square root of negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 equals positive 1, which I don't want. And if I were to make these both positives, positive 1 times positive 1 is a positive 1. The only way that I can get a negative 1 is if I take negative 1 times 1. That's not a perfect square. I can't do the square root of that because these are not the same values. They're two different values. This is what's called imaginary numbers. The square root of 1 equals 1, but a negative under a square root indicates that I have an imaginary number. That means that the square root of negative 1 equals 1i. The second example, square root of negative 25. Because I'm doing a square root of a negative, that means I'm going to have an imaginary number. I can do the square root of 25, and that just equals the whole number 5. So the square root of a negative 25 is equal to 5i. That's how we represent the imaginary number for the square root of negative 25. Let's go through simplifying the square root of 640. I want to factor this, and my goal is to try to use factors that are perfect squares. 640 is the same as 64 times 10. I can do the square root of 64. That's equal to the whole number 8. Square root of 10 doesn't simplify any further, so that means I have 8 square roots of 10. If this would be negative 640, we would do a similar process to that. The only difference is now I have a negative, so I'm going to represent that as negative 1, the square root of negative 1, times square root of 64, times the square root of 10. The square root of negative 1 is an imaginary number. We represent that using the letter I. Square root of 64 is an 8. Square root of 10 does not simplify. Now the correct way to write this simplified expression would be 8i followed by square root of 10. Two more examples. The square root of negative 120. I'm going to break this up as 3 factors. I'm going to use the square root of negative 1 because I have a negative. Then I have square root of 4 because 120 is divisible by 4, and square root of 30. 4 is a perfect square. It's the whole number 2. My square root of negative 1 means I have an imaginary number, so I'm going to represent that with I, then followed by square root of 30. So my simplified answer would be 2i times square root of 30. In the second example, here would be my 3 factors that I'm going to use, and I'm using square root of 49 because 49 is a perfect square. That means my simplified answer would be 7i times the square root of 3. So anytime you have a negative 1 under a square root, that's going to be represented by the letter I to mean we have an imaginary number. Here's 5 examples to try out. Just press pause when you're ready to check your answers. Hit play. Okay, here's the 5 answers. Notice in the third example, I do not have an imaginary number in my answer. My negative is not under the square root. My negative is just a coefficient out front, which means I have a -1 multiplied to the other terms. In the bottom example, I have a negative inside and outside the square root. The negative inside is represented as the square root of -1, which in turn becomes an imaginary number in my final simplified answer. My -6 comes from the -3 being multiplied to a 2.